Our second scripture lesson today comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, verses 38 to 42. See if you can see the similarities between these two texts. Then some of the scribes and the Pharisees said to him, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so for 3 days and 3 nights the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. The people of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the proclamation of Jonah and see something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to listen to the wisdom of Solomon, and see, something greater than Solomon is here." This is the word of the Lord. So can I see by a show of hands how many people in here like chocolate? How many people like chocolate? That's good. I know there's always some chocolate haters in the audience, so I want to make sure I weed you out first before I get into all this. So, yeah, I know you hate chocolate, but that's okay. You hate sweets generally. So, if you love chocolate, then you probably know that there's all kinds of different brands of chocolate out there that make really, really good chocolate. There's Toblerone, there's Cadbury, there's Dove, right? There's all kinds of different chocolates, Godiva, right? And depending on your taste and the type of chocolate you love, there's a niche for just about everyone. But if you're a kid, there's generally only one brand of chocolate that you like. Can you guess what that is? Hershey. Very good. Okay. Now, Hershey is not considered to be high-end chocolate, but it has a taste that everybody generally loves, and this is not by accident. I want to tell you a little bit about Milton Hershey and how he came to create the biggest chocolate empire on earth. Milton Hershey, he got into the sweets business from a very young age. He started by apprenticing under a confectionery chef when he was a kid, and then when he got to be about a teenager, he decided, you know what, I want to go off on my own, and I want to do this by myself. And so in 1876, he got some money from his mom, and he moved out of his hometown of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, or Lancaster, as they call it over there, and he moved to Philadelphia, where he opened up his own confectionery business. That shop was open for 6 years before it went bankrupt. Knowing he needed to expand his skills a little bit, he decided he wanted to go all over the country and learn some new tricks of the trade. And so eventually, after going several different places, he ends up in New York City, and he's working for a chain of stores known as Hoolier's. Now, Hoolier's, they were a restaurant and candy chain, and they were one of the best. And so he trained under some confectionery chefs there, and he decided, you know what, I'm ready to go out on my own again. He goes into New York City, he starts his own confectionery shop there, and it lasts for 3 years before it goes out of business. Now, I think most people at this point would have sat Hershey down and said, you know, Milton, I think you've given it a good shot, but perhaps it's time for you to try a different profession. Thankfully, he did not, and he kept striving in spite of his failure. Out of money, he moved back home to Lancaster, and he's back with his family, and he turns his focus to caramel. Now, at the time that he was getting into the sweets industry, it was very, very challenging to find ingredients that would not spoil. And because they didn't have access to refrigeration, this was very common for them to use ingredients that could last for a while. And milk tended not to be one of those ingredients. But he's there in Lancaster, and of course, the only thing in Lancaster is cows. There's nothing else there. And so he has access to all kinds of fresh milk. And so he starts experimenting with putting fresh milk into the caramel. And with that, he found success. In 1887, he founded what became known as the Lancaster Caramel Company. Now, one of his most popular products was caramel covered in chocolate, right? Sounds really good right now, just even thinking about it. So he realized at the time, he didn't make his own chocolate when he was covering these things up. He got his chocolate from suppliers. And then 13 years later, he goes in 1900 to see chocolate making machines for the first time. And he's blown away by it. And he goes back home to Lancaster and he decides he's going to sell his caramel business. He sells it for $1 million. That's $28 million in today's money. And when people asked him, why are you selling such a successful company? You're doing great. And he's famous for saying, caramel, that's just a fad. But chocolate is a permanent thing. And how right he was, right? He used the money from that purchase to go and buy land about 30 miles northwest of Lancaster in this place called Dairy Church, Pennsylvania. I actually lived about 15 minutes away from there when I was back in Harrisburg. It's now mostly referred to as Hershey, Pennsylvania, because that's pretty much what it is. It's Hershey. And he wanted that land because he needed cows so that he'd have enough milk to make his milk chocolate, right? Now, at the time when he was getting into the sweets industry, what's important for you to understand is that it was very difficult to make milk chocolate. And so it was expensive and considered to be a luxury product. But what Hershey wanted to do was to make milk chocolate accessible to everyone. He wanted to make it affordable. So he worked on his own personal formula in a way that would make it mass producible. In 1903, he broke ground on what would become the largest chocolate manufacturing plant in the world. And by 1905, it was open for business and it was equipped with the latest mass production technology. But there was one little problem. His factory was in the middle of nowhere. So even though he had created all of this potential for hundreds of new jobs, there was nobody to fill them because nobody could actually get to the plant. They didn't live close enough to it. And so the way he solved this problem was by building a town around the plant. The way he inspired people to come work for him was he offered them housing, a good, decent living wage, and a nice place to raise a family. And as a result, Hershey was the first national brand of chocolate that was known everywhere. It was ubiquitous. And in 1907, he came up with his most famous product, the Hershey Kiss, which is what really set him on the map. That's a wonderful story, isn't it? I mean, we love stories like that, particularly here in America. His gumption, his unwillingness to give up in the face of adversity, I mean, that's inspirational to say the least. And I think as Americans, we like stories like this because it reinforces our belief that if you work hard in America and you strive to do your very best, that anyone has the potential to be successful. But with every success story, there are usually consequences. And we don't like to talk about those consequences because it can dampen the euphoria we feel when someone has been very successful. And to understand what those consequences are, to understand how they relate to you and to me, I need to take a moment and go into the scriptures, because we're going to come back to those consequences, but we can't do that until we've talked about the scriptures a little bit. We're doing, during the season of Advent, a different sermon series. It's called Jesus As, and the idea is that as we anticipate Jesus being born on December 25th, we are talking about how Jesus represents the culmination of so many different characters from the Old Testament. Now, we've talked about Jesus as, who remembers what did Adrian preach on Jesus as? Moses. Then we did last week Jesus as Joseph, and this week we're doing Jesus as Jonah. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to guess that most of you have probably never compared Jesus to Jonah. In fact, I'm pretty sure some of you don't even know who Jonah is. So why don't we go through, we're going to talk about who Jonah is, and then we're going to talk about how he's related to Jesus. So let's start with Jonah. Jonah is this guy in the Bible. He actually has his own book, and he's asked by God to go to this place called Nineveh and preach about God. Now, Nineveh, you have to know a little bit of history about that to understand what happens in the story. Nineveh was one of the most important cities in the ancient world. It was the capital of a nation called Assyria. Now, the Assyrians, they were known for their brutality and their violence. When they would take over a region, it was not uncommon for them to bring some of the population out into the town square and skin them alive from head to toe just to instill fear in the population. They're kind of like the ISIS of the ancient world. So you can understand why Jonah was not particularly excited to go to this place and preach to them about God. And he did what any of us would do in that situation. He went in the exact opposite direction and got out of Dodge. So he gets on this ship and he's going to this place called Tarshish. Now, if I had my monitors up, I would show you where Tarshish is, but I don't have monitors up, so I just have to explain it to you. So we have Nineveh. If you can imagine, it's over in kind of the Middle East, right? Tarshish is located in Spain. It's all the way across the Mediterranean. It's about as far away as you could get in the ancient world. So he's on the ship. They're going over there, and what happens? This storm comes upon them. And all the men on the boat, they're convinced that it's because God is angry at one of them, and they determine that that person is Jonah, so they chuck him overboard, and all of a sudden the storm ceases. And while Jonah's there bobbing in the water, this big fish comes up and swallows him whole and takes him down. If you're thinking of Pinocchio, yes, that is where they took that plot point from. They stole it from the Bible. So for 3 days and 3 nights, he's in the belly of this fish, and then at a certain point, he gets spit back up onto dry land. The Hebrew for this is vomit, right, Adam? Vomit. Yep. And so I just want everybody to know the Hebrew about that. That's really important, okay? So he spits him back up onto dry land, and then he figures, well, there's no way I'm going to get out of this. So he goes to Nineveh, and he preaches, and everyone from the king all the way down to the commoners, they all convert, and it's a wonderful story because everybody turns to God. It's a great story, right? What does it have to do with Jesus? Well, in the scripture I read to you from Matthew, Jesus, he's hanging around all these people, and they say, hey, can you give us a sign, something to show us that you are actually the Messiah? And Jesus says, well, no sign will be given except for the sign of Jonah. What is the sign of Jonah? I am glad you asked. So what he does is he says, look, here's the deal. For just as Jonah was in the belly of the sea monster for 3 days and 3 nights, so for 3 days and 3 nights the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. Now, what does that mean? Well, this word belly is actually very important. In the Hebrew, it's translated, you say it's maye, and you can translate it as belly, but you can also translate it as bowels. Bowels. And what that's referring to is the bowels of the earth, where the Hebrew people believed that Sheol was located. Now, I know I'm throwing a lot of words out at you here, so let's talk about Sheol for a second. That word Sheol, what it refers to, is it's where the Hebrews believed your soul would go after you died. It's kind of like the Hebrew version of Hades. It's pretty much exactly equivalent. So when Jonah, when he's swallowed up by this big fish, and he's taken down, it's like he's dead for 3 days. He experiences what it's like to be dead for 3 days, and then when he's spit back up onto land, it's like he's come back to life. So in the same way that Jonah, he's in the belly of this fish for 3 days, and he's dead. Jesus, when he's crucified, what happens? He dies for 3 days, and then he comes back to life. He rises from the grave. Now this is called the sign of Jonah, and it's actually something that we reference in the Apostles' Creed. So in the Creed, what do we say? We say Jesus, he was crucified, dead, and buried, and then he descended into hell. That's the reference, and rose again from the dead 3 days later. So I've always found that to be rather striking. Why does Jesus have to descend into hell? Like, what's the point of that? I remember when I was back at the Methodist Church in Princeton, and I was doing the youth groups there, I taught a series on the Apostles' Creed. And we came to that part, and I realized that in the Methodist Church, they don't actually include that line in their Apostles' Creed. And so I asked my supervisor, I said, why don't you all have that in there? And she said, well, we just don't like the idea of our Savior going to hell. And I was like, all right, well, whatever, that's fine by me. And so I thought about that a little bit more, and I was like, actually, that detracts from what Jesus is all about. Because if Jesus never experienced hell, and we need to talk about what that word means in a second, but if he never experienced hell, then it really takes away from his death and that meaning that it has for us. So let me take a moment and explain to you how the ancients understood hell, Sheol, Hades, or the underworld, because they're all the same thing. So, when the Bible was written, people believed that when you died and when you were buried, that upon being buried, your soul would descend into this place called the underworld. Now, the mythology for this, supposedly it comes from this series of caves in Greece known as Aleppo-Trypa. Now, if I had my monitors again, I'd show you a picture of Aleppo-Trypa so you could see it. And it's a cave, and in the middle of this cave is actually a freshwater lake. And if you remember in the version of Hades, the myth, you go in, and then you get on this boat, you pay Charon, and he takes you across into the underworld. And it all comes from this cave. And as this myth spread throughout the Mediterranean, people would look at openings to other caves and they would say, oh, that's an opening to Hades or hell or Sheol. Now, what's important for you to understand about this is that it's not like heaven. Heaven, from their point of view, was inaccessible to human beings. But here's the thing. Sheol, hell, that was accessible. That's a literal, physical place that if you were a human being, you could go to if you wanted to, because there's literally an opening to a cave. So if you imagine, what they thought was, you die, you're buried, your soul descends into this series of caves underneath the earth, literally an underworld, where we live in the upper world. And so people would actually try to go into these caves, and at the time, there was a lot of noxious fumes being emitted by the earth, and it could make people pass out, and it could actually kill them. And so not many people would come back after going into some of these caves. And so it just added to the mythology that not everyone is able to simply walk in to Hades to find your dead relatives and speak to them. So, here's the thing. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't believe that hell is some physical place like the ancients did that you can visit. Nor do I believe that hell is some fiery pit where your soul burns for all eternity. In my opinion, hell is a frame of mind. You can experience hell on this earth, right here, right now, just as much as you can experience hell in the afterlife. Hell is when you feel trapped and unable to escape your circumstances. Hell is when you experience constant physical, emotional, or mental anguish with no hope of ever finding relief. Hell, most importantly though, is when you feel as though God is absent from your life. The moment that people tend to have no hope is the same moment that they feel that they have been abandoned by God. Because when everybody else has turned their back on you, I think most people at least feel, you know what? That at least God is still there for me. And the moment that you feel that God has left you and abandoned you, I think that's when a lot of people end up having no hope. Now, what does Jonah, Jesus, and hell have to do with Milton Hershey? Well, let me tell you. So Milton Hershey, when he was working on his chocolate formula, he got the cocoa beans to make his chocolate formula, and this is cocoa beans. I touched them, but they smell absolutely disgusting, let me tell you. They don't smell like that, that's for sure. So he got his cocoa beans from South America. Now, initially, those people in South America who owned all that land, they had owned that land for centuries, and they harvested the land themselves, and they sent that cocoa bean up to Hershey. But Hershey's dream of making chocolate accessible to everyone, it changed the landscape of the way the cocoa bean was harvested. When South America could no longer keep up with the pace of demand, they had to look for other places they could grow the cocoa bean, and it only grows in a certain band of latitude on the earth. And so the next place that they saw, which was really good, was actually over in Africa. Ghana's a big place where they grow cocoa beans. But one of the issues is that Hershey, he was the largest purchaser of cocoa beans in the world, and so he had a monopoly on the product, and therefore he could essentially name his own price, what he was willing to pay per kilogram of cocoa bean. And so the profits for these landowners, it was very, very razor thin. And so as a result, they had to choose between paying their laborers and keeping profit for themselves. And initially, they paid adult laborers to do this. But then they realized over time that it would be a little bit cheaper if they just brought kids in because they could pay them less. And then a little bit later on, these landowners also decided, well, you know what? We could just make a lot of money by enslaving these children and forcing them to do the work. To this day, child slave labor is still very much in practice on cocoa farms in Africa. And the Hershey Chocolate Company has been cited by many human rights groups as being the worst perpetrator of child slave labor in the world. So every time we purchase a Hershey chocolate bar, every time we peel the foil off of a Hershey Kiss, we are financially supporting the enslavement of children. Now, I told you at the beginning of this sermon that with every success story, there are consequences. And in order to understand those consequences, I want to talk just for a second about Milton Hershey. Now, his idea to make chocolate affordable to the world, that wasn't a bad idea. That's a great concept. I don't think anybody would deny that except for maybe the obesity epidemic that we have right now. But other than that, it's a pretty good idea, right? It makes a lot of sense. But here's the unfortunate consequence of it, is that in order to make that dream come true, to make the cocoa bean affordable, it caused the enslavement of thousands of children who have to experience hell on earth. These kids have been stripped of their childhood, of their dignity. They have been stripped of the ability to have a good life because they have been forced to work 18 hours a day with no break, no hope of a good future, and no pay. All so that we can have chocolate whenever we want. Now, I would say that most of us here in this church, in Arlington Heights, we have no idea what that's like, what these kids are going through. We have no concept of the suffering that they're dealing with. But Jesus does. Jesus does understand it. And though we often talk about all the wonderful things that Jesus did, how he was such a success, his success is the result of the fact that he suffered a great deal. When Jesus was on the cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That word forsaken, it can also be translated as abandoned. So he's saying, think about that for a second. My God, why have you abandoned me? That's what he felt when he was on that cross. And so the reason why the sign of Jonah is so important, the reason why we allude to it in the Apostles' Creed, is because it tells us that in our darkest moments, when hell is all around us, that Jesus understands what we're going through. He understands the hell that you've experienced in your life, and he understands the hell that those kids are going through right now. He knows what it means to feel like you have been forgotten by God. And this is why Jesus is so very important for us. Because when everyone else has turned their backs on us, he reaches out his hand and says, "Follow me. I know where you've been, and I know how to lead you out of this." Everyone who is lost in darkness needs someone to guide them to the light. And Jesus has been that guide for Christians for millennia. He's been that guide for me. I would suspect that he has been that guide for many of you. But here's the thing. Jesus only asks that if he has guided you to the light, that you guide others who are lost in darkness. And so this morning, my prayer for you is that when you find someone who has descended into hell, that you would not leave them there. We are here to help each other when life seems insurmountable. We here in Arlington Heights, we may not be able to free those children over there who have been enslaved. I mean, we can stop buying Hershey products. That's what we can do on one side, but we're not going to be able to stop those kids from being enslaved. But what we can do is we can free people in our midst who have no hope and who feel abandoned. So when you find someone who has descended into hell, may you be